Donald Trump is planning to meet Putin in Saudi Arabia to discuss ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. The Kremlin suggested that a face-to-face meeting will be organised promptly. US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth, who's at the meeting of NATO defence ministers in Brussels, has defended Trump's rapid push for peace talks.
There's no betrayal there. There is a recognition that the whole world and the United States is invested and interested in peace, a negotiated peace. As President Trump has said, stopping the killing. And so that will require both sides recognizing things they don't want to. That's why I think the world is fortunate to have President Trump. Only he at this moment could convene the powers that be to bring peace, and that's a welcome sign.
So what will Russia look like in a post-war world? This morning, the journalist Stephen Dalliel told Times Radio Breakfast that Putin will find it difficult to return from a war economy.
Putin wants chaos in Europe. That suits his narrative. And actually saying that he wants peace now, he's shifted the whole Russian economy to a wartime economy. It would actually be very difficult for him tomorrow to sign a peace deal and say, oh, we're going back to normal, because it's all sorts of ramifications, not least of which is that there are hundreds of thousands of Russians who are now actually doing quite well out of the war, who are earning more. And if you go back now suddenly to a peacetime economy, their income is going to drop dramatically, their standard of living will drop dramatically, and he causes huge social problems back in his own country. So Trump is reading this all wrong.
Well, let's talk more about this. Charles Hecker is a former reporter for the Moscow Times in Russia and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. You were nodding your head to that. Would you agree?
Well, military spending in Russia has skyrocketed over the past few years, and especially in the past year since 2023. And military spending in Russia is now 6.7% of GDP, according to recent statistics. And so there is a constituency in Russia that would like to see the war continue because they're doing quite well out of it. They're getting enormous sums of money out of government coffers. And yes, there has been a reorientation of the Russian economy towards militarization. There's enormous social spending for soldiers' families, and for the families of soldiers who die. What's interesting is that on news of the phone call between Trump and Putin, Moscow markets, such as they are, they absolutely leapt at the news. And the Russian business community is now, all of a sudden, full of enormous new energy. And I think what they're thinking is that any kind of rapprochement between the East and the West, between the West and Russia on Ukraine, is their chance to get back into the mix as business people. And so we'll see what happens to that part, to the private sector, and to other Russian state-owned entities, whether they sort of gear up now that they think the war might be ending.
How much is Trump invested in this? Because he is literally invested in this.
That's right. Well, he's invested both sort of metaphorically and financially in a lot of ventures around the world. He's also invested in this process politically, because you'll remember that candidate Trump said that he would solve the war in Ukraine in a day. That day has already come and gone. But the talks today, a 90-minute telephone conversation between the two presidents is a big deal. And so this is essentially the starting gun on negotiations. That doesn't mean that they're going to take off at any enormous pace. President Putin is probably interested in prolonging these talks. He is relatively more successful in Ukraine on the ground than he has been in the past. So there's no immediate hurry. The Russian economy is pressuring him, but militarily he's gaining ground. President Trump is the one who's putting himself a little bit more on the line here as the alleged peacemaker.
Doesn't it also suit Putin to be able to say, look, I'm fighting a war over here, and that is the reason why so many of you are poor, are feeling the privations of the world, good times around the corner?
So inflation in Russia is absolutely crushing. And interest rates in Russia are double the rate of inflation, and they're somewhere in the low 20s, 21% official central bank rates in Russia. And yes, the economy is feeling an incredible squeeze. This acceleration of military spending and a labor shortage in Russia has put the economy in a real vice grip. I think President Putin, while he would like to relieve that pressure, the economy has been much more resilient than we expected. And I think that he can use his propaganda tools to squeeze probably at least another year of hardship out of the Russian population and out of the Russian economy.
What does peace look like to the average Russian? Is it really something to celebrate? We don't talk very often about the tragedy of this conflict, which is the cost of human life, the thousands, hundreds of thousands of families who are grieving, often young men who've died at the front.
That's right. And there's no question in Ukraine and in Russia, no matter what your political persuasion, there's no question that everybody wants the killing to stop. I mean, the casualties on both sides have been absolutely astronomical. And whether you're a soldier's family or a relative or someone who's facing the potential of conscription, you want this over. You want the human tragedy to end on both sides. You know, the question now, though, is what does victory look like for either side in this conflict? And so far, including some of the principles that President Trump has marched out in reaching this attempted settlement, most of this looks more like victory for Russia, even though it may not have been the victory that they anticipated. It's looking much better for Russia than it is for Ukraine.
What does it look like for Trump further down the line? Just a great big, fantastic, I came along, I said what I was going to do, I did what I was going to say, all of that.
So President Trump wants to win the Nobel Prize. And he thinks that by settling the conflicts in the Middle East and between Russia and Ukraine puts him to the head of the queue for the Nobel Peace Prize. That's part of what this looks like for him. The next question is what President Trump does in terms, for example, of sanctions on Russia. President Trump, when he was running for re-election, said that he doesn't like sanctions. He thinks that they punish the dollar globally, and he wants to relieve that sort of stigma on the dollar that comes from sanctioning Russia and the rest of the use of sanctions as military and economic tools. So he may set the business community loose again on Russia and turn to the U.S. and say, go back. Go and do business with Russia now.
And is that part of the reason why one of his executive orders was about foreign companies not being able to be convicted of corruption abroad?
Yeah, that was a major shocker. That was really, really
Well, there have been a few
interesting.
shockers this week. I mean,
That's right.
Just, was that Tuesday's shocker? I can't remember.
The list is long. I think that was the breakfast shocker, 2 days ago.
Yeah.
After years and years and years of a tightening noose and an increasing grip on corruption abroad, President Trump has said, don't worry about paying bribes, because if you get caught, we're not hugely concerned about prosecuting you. The signal to American companies is actually a mixed one, because American companies had, I think, genuinely been working hard to stay cleaner abroad, and doing business without paying bribes is less expensive. And what he's almost saying is, get back in the mix with everybody else who's forking out cash to government officials and mix it up. And that's really an unusual signal.
Do you think the Nobel Peace Prize Committee will overlook that?
Well, they have made some odd decisions in the past, so nothing would surprise. Lisa has a question for you. Talking of giving US access to Ukraine's rare minerals, a large percentage of those minerals are inside Russian-occupied territory. I don't know whether that's true. Is it possible that Trump has come to some kind of arrangement with Putin for access? Now, there was a Treasury official in Ukraine, wasn't there, this week?
That's right. It's quite unusual for somebody to send their Treasury secretary to a country that's at war. And the question here is, and this was, the other shocker of the week, was when President Trump said, look, we'll protect you and we'll send you weapons and support, but in exchange for this, we want access to all the rare earth minerals that's under your soil. And we know that these are minerals that are important for modern economies, that are used in chips and used in electronics and in solar panels and in electric batteries and things like that. But the signal that message sends is, we'll protect you only if there's something financial in it for us. And if there isn't, and if there isn't in Ukraine, or if there isn't somewhere else, we're not really going to pull out our finger to help you.
What does Russia look like post-Putin, and when might that be?
Yeah, so post-Putin is one question, and when that starts. I think we're going to have to wait for President Putin to die of natural causes. There doesn't seem to be, either inside or outside of Russia, the figurehead who has sort of the leadership, the following, and the appetite for risk.
Or who's still alive.
Or, point very well made, who's still alive or who isn't afraid of dying or winding up in prison and dying.
Or falling out of a window, because that happens to a perplexing number of
That's right. Balconies have
opponents.
become very, very slippery in Russia.
Yeah, really.
And so there really doesn't seem to be the kind of figurehead out there, politically, economically, or militarily, or otherwise, to lead that effort. What happens after? Speculation and a little bit of old-fashioned Kremlinology, but I think it's a massive Moscow-based internal struggle, maybe a little mini political purge, and then the emergence of somebody who might be Western-looking and a little bit more liberal, or might actually be even more of a hardliner than Putin was.
Do you think there'll be a woman?
Highly unlikely.
Good to talk to you. Charles, thank you very much indeed. Really, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much. I hope you can come back on the programme. Charles
Pleasure.
Hecker is a former reporter for the Moscow Times in Russia and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia.
Yeah, strong men can't be women.
That's very true, Jim.
Yeah, just thought
What a
I'd-
profound point you've
Thank
made
you.
there.
Well, one of many.